Hello and welcome to this episode of Our Longevity Futures. I'm your host, Chris Curwen, and I have the absolute pleasure of being joined by Camilla Cavendish. Camilla is an award-winning writer and broadcaster, as well as a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. She is a regular columnist for the Financial Times, former government advisor, and she is also the author of Extra Time, 10 Lessons for an Aging World. Welcome and thank you so much for joining me, Camilla.
Thank you so much, Chris.
So my first question is something that I like to ask everyone who comes on because it's just so fascinating, the different sort of perspectives you get. So what is your personal definition of aging?
So I always think aging is a really loaded word, which I sort of prefer not to use in a way. But I think if I have to, if you push me, I'll say it's a natural process that we shouldn't be ashamed of, and actually that we can control more than we think.
So how did you personally get interested in the issue of longevity, especially from looking at the sort of biotechnology world of it?
So I was researching this book partly from Harvard, where, as you say, I have a fellowship. And I was interested in a lot of aspects, but because I was sitting at Harvard and with MIT kind of next door, I was able to talk to some really fantastic biologists and geneticists. Including, in fact, Cynthia Kenyon, who was on the West Coast, who, famously isolated the DAF2 gene in C. elegans worms. And I think what fascinated me was that there are decades of science now looking at ways in which genes can really prolong life quite substantially, and not just prolong life, shorten the twilight zone at the end. And for me, that is the most interesting thing, is not just can we live forever or can we live longer, but how do we shorten those twilight years, particularly of the ones including dementia, which is what people most fear.
So in the first chapter of your book, you talk about how global demographics are changing, becoming unsustainably unbalanced by the ever-increasing elderly population, otherwise known as a silver tsunami. Do you think the UK government and governments around the globe are doing enough to prepare for these changes? And if not, what changes would you suggest that they might make?
So I think, and obviously I sat, as you said, I ran the number 10 policy unit, so I sat in government, which was engulfed by its own tsunami of looking at health costs rising and pensions costs rising. I think governments have to reframe their view. I think they're far too pessimistic. I think they have to keep pushing up retirement ages. Not necessarily for everybody, because obviously what we're also seeing is a huge divergence in how people age. But they have to get much more serious about those health inequalities. And actually, I think governments have been quite reluctant to intervene in preventative health, to talk to people about lifestyles, but it's becoming increasingly clear that if you're rich and better off and you live in particular parts of a country, whether that's the US or UK, you have a much better chance of having a much longer and healthier life than if you don't. And that, I think, has to become an issue that governments have to act on.
So, yeah, you mentioned there, and like you mentioned in your previous writing, that the wealthiest 10% of the population is likely to live a good, I think it was 18 years longer than the poorest, creating this not only inequality of wealth, but also a biological divide between the rich and the poor. So how would you actually propose we resolve this issue? I know it's a huge question, but what are your ideas on that subject?
Yeah, look, I mean, there is no one silver bullet. And if you talk to people like Michael Marmot, he will talk about the whole life course and poverty, housing, pollution, a whole set of stress, a whole set of things that bear on this. Obviously, one of the things I'm known for is having introduced the sugar tax on fizzy drinks when I worked in the government, which was people feel very strongly about, which is a tiny, tiny move to try and start to tackle obesity. I do think that obesity is an epidemic. I do think it's reducing the life chances of many of the poorest people in our society, and I think there is quite a lot that governments can do about that. But I think it's also empowering and encouraging doctors to take preventative health seriously. And as I say in the book, I mean, 9 out of 10 doctors in the US and 8 out of 10 GPs in the UK admit that they're very reluctant to talk to people about their weight at all. And we ought to make it like smoking. It ought to be absolutely axiomatic that you talk to patients about it and you try weight loss programs and you support people through it.
So we face several ethical challenges when caring for a growing population that is aging. So how do we address these in a way that is positively affects the whole society?
Do you want to tell me a bit more about which ethical challenges you're thinking of?
Yeah, so in supporting an elderly population, obviously when it comes to monetarily and economically, it's going to be a massive challenge for the sort of the working population. How do we mitigate that?
Yes, so obviously in the UK, we've recently passed the point where actually the average pensioner household is now better off than the average working household. And that is as a result of a policy put in place about 10 years ago, which was designed to make pensioners better off, but actually has slightly over-egged it because it was pegged to various different indicators. The real issue is, as I say, it's between the sort of rich and poor. So if you look at analysis in the US, some really interesting analysis has been done by the Academy of Sciences, which suggests that even if you wrap up all the disability benefits that go to poorer people, if richer people are living so much longer, they're going to start taking a bigger share of the welfare budget than anybody ever meant them to take. So I'm afraid there are some really tough decisions to be made about that, but they're not just going to be based on age. They're going to be based on characteristics, which is, of course, much harder to do. So you've got to have the two things in tandem, I think. You've got to tackle the health inequalities, and you've got to make the welfare budgets much more nuanced. I mean, you might want, for example, to be increasing disability budgets while you're cutting social security benefits for richer people.
So technology is evolving faster than social policy at the moment, and it's critical to not fall behind because that would involve various challenges, and most notably the fast-paced development of modern biotech vaccines such as COVID. This highlights this fact. In what way can these technologies be used to improve public policy and population health?
So that's another brilliant but huge question. I think we need a much better understanding. So it's the old sort of C.S. Lewis dilemma, isn't it? I mean, we clearly need policymakers to have a much better understanding of the science. And if you look at the whole debate around CRISPR and the germline editing, I think there needs to be, in that particular case, the ethical challenges are so serious once you take it to the germline that there probably needs to be more of an informed public debate. I think data plays a huge part in this. And historically, people have been very reluctant to give away their medical data or medical information. And that has actually stymied quite a few attempts to introduce technology or do bigger trials. I actually think COVID is a huge opportunity to change that perception, because people have seen the rapidity of the vaccine rollout, the development of the science. And there's a kind of moment where politicians, I think, need to level with people and become a bit bolder about saying, actually, sharing your data, particularly in the UK, where we have a universal health service. I mean, we could be making much better use of the data than we are.
And I mean, these are such huge questions, as you said. We could probably spend an hour chatting about each one. Yeah. So apologies for the vastness. But yeah, we're sort of skimming over a few, and hopefully in the near future we'll have you back on to maybe delve into these areas a bit more deeply. But as a regular columnist for the Financial Times, you claim that longevity will impact many aspects of our lives, more than just healthcare. And what we need to keep a firm grasp on the future with regard to regulation, to education, workforce development, if we want to avoid major economic shocks. So what do you see in the future of longevity, especially for aging people and the general population?
So I think that it's the combination of people living longer and plummeting birth rates. I mean, that's what's bringing about this kind of cataclysm. And that's what's making governments across the world so scared. They're trying to bribe people into having children. I think what that does is it actually starts to challenge our notions of family itself. So you have to start thinking differently about support networks. I've interviewed women all over the world who are deciding not to have children for a whole series of reasons that I write about in the book. We've actually seen that this year under COVID, that the lockdown baby boom has not happened. And so, the China one-child policy, which has been reversed but has had no impact on the Chinese population, is actually being replicated in all sorts of other places without government intervention. That's completely fascinating. But it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. We just have to revise our notion of what is the support network you're looking for when you're older. And crucially, I think longevity means we have to think about meaning. I mean, it might sound a bit hokey, but I mean, we need to think about purpose and meaning. And we've still got this cliff edge of retirement. And I've interviewed so many people who've fallen over that cliff edge. Quite often they've rushed over the cliff edge, delighted by the thought that they're going to have many more years on the golf course, and then become seriously disillusioned with it, or maybe, financially threatened by it. But I just think we have to change our assumptions, and we're remarkably traditional and conventional in the way we think. So I give a lot of talks to big companies about the future of work. Now, it's astonishing that so many big companies still retire people at 60. They have a really conventional notion, and we all have it in our heads. We have a career timetable in our heads of actually at what age are we going to do what. Now, funny enough, I have had a very unconventional career. I've sort of fallen into interesting things when they've come along, but I'm very unusual. And I meet people continually who have sort of got to their 50s and suddenly think, oh my God, what am I going to do next? We shouldn't be like that. There's been a suggestion of a mid-career MOT, which I think is a great idea. Sit people down, talk to them about their future, give them some hope. I think we just don't realize as a culture how conventionally we think about this stuff.
Now, you mentioned your goddaughter in the book, and she might grow up in a wildly different world from ourselves in regards to the actual definition of aging.
Right.
So in what way should we educate our children differently to prepare them for a future where longevity and long life is much more common?
Yeah, that's great you noticed that. And I was writing about the bet that was made between J.L. Shansky and Steve Asted.
Which is actually the first time I'd heard of it, so that was a really fascinating little tidbit.
And they're two wonderful professors, and they made this bet that would there or would there not be a 150-year-old human by, I think it was 2150. And there are interesting views on either side of that, but fundamentally, it definitely points to something that my 19-year-old goddaughter at the time has to think about, which is, I think if you're asking, what her school should be telling her, her school should have been saying, you're going to live a hell of a lot longer than you expect. I mean, at the moment, if you ask the actuaries, they say that about 2/3 of people seriously underestimate how long they have to live. One reason I wrote the book was because my beloved father, to whom the book is dedicated, seriously underestimated how long he'd have to live, and also how healthy and able he would be. And as a result, his life kind of shrank before it should have done. So I think there's an awful lot we can do to say to people, look, have you thought about it? You're going to have, it's wonderful. You're going to have all these different careers, all these different possibilities. And the other thing we're seeing is, of course, that adolescence is extending longer. So I think in the UK and Australia, and I think the US, the average age of leaving home is now 24. There are parents tearing their hair out all over the country at being the banker mum and dad. It's just things are changing, and we have to recognise that.
So the book so wonderfully entwines the statistics around this matter as well as storytelling. It really is a fascinating read, and you must have had so many interesting chats with fascinating individuals. So my final question is there something, a conversation, a piece of technology, a word of wisdom, an idea which resonated with you that you would like to share to finish off this interview?
Okay, well, what I would love to share with you is a nursing home in Holland that I visited, where university students live in exchange for doing 30 hours a week with the old people. And it's as you can imagine, it is the most heartwarming, and it's very much a two-way experience. But what I'd like to quote for you is what the manager of that home said to me, which is, it used to be that when residents came, they had to fill out 100 questions on a form. Now they only ask you 3 questions. And the questions are, who are you? Who were you? And who are you going to be? And when you think that the average age of residents in that care home is more than 85, that gives you a sense of the possibility and the philosophy that we should apply to aging.
100%. Well, that's a brilliant way to finish it. So thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find more about you and your book?
Well, you can buy it on Amazon.
There we go.
Although I hate to, that's an easy way. Or you can go to a bookshop if they ever reopen.
Yeah, no, I definitely advise people to do the same, as I have been doing. So yeah, again, thank you so much for joining me, Camilla. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Good luck with everything, and yeah, thank you very much, guys. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.